Evening and welcome once again to Gaming Under the Influence. I'm Mike, here with Alex, coming to you from GreenDragonCVR in Woodbridge to talk to you about video games. How are you, buddy?
Yes, I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Good. I have just started to play Persona 5 as of this week, and I'm enjoying it a lot, hot on the tails of Xenoblade Chronicles.
Nice. You're on quite the JRPG kick.
Yeah, man. And from what I've understood, you've played some of those this year too, right?
Yeah. I played... I've been playing actually Octopath Traveler a little bit, dabbling in Pokemon like I usually do, some of the old ones.
Yeah.
There's always a JRPG I feel like that's just kind of floating around. I'm either just experimenting with or replaying something, or, you know, we're always on JRPGs, you know how it is.
That's right, just like with the Souls-likes, and they're like quite different genres, which is maybe something we're going to talk about today, but I thought it'd be worthwhile to go over what we think are the greatest JRPG series of all time.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd say it was hard making this list, but it actually wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't too difficult,
yeah.
I would say. I mean, I think, you know, they kind of just spring to mind.
Yeah,
if you know anything about JRPGs or played any of them.
That's right. These seem pretty self-evident to me.
Yeah.
There's probably a few it would have been nice to mention with more time, but if you're asking for the best, these are certainly it.
Yeah, like the upper echelon, the, you know, top of the class.
Yeah. The diamond encrusted the best stuff. And I guess the first thing that, you know, anybody would need to mention when talking about something like this is Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
It really is the pioneering JRPG franchise. And it took what I guess at that time had been a primarily Western genre of, you know, literature and media, which is fantasy. And, you know, from its D&D Western counterparts and from Conan the Barbarian, all of this stuff. And it took that and, you know, via Hironobu Sakaguchi and the other people involved, we got this whole series of different worlds with jobs and magic systems, kind of aping the world of D&D, but with an entirely different Japanese flair and full of ideas, I would say, are different.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially I think if you look at the monsters and stuff like that, you see a lot of the designs that look similar to like D&D style like monsters. Yeah,
some things are a clear giveaway, but I think this is something that, you know, you saw this kind of transmission of fantasy tropes between like Lord of the Rings and Warhammer and D&D and all of this, but I think it's unique in this case because the outward art and, you know, symbols and ideas, they're crossing cultural divides and they become kind of ensouled, filled with different meaning. You know, going over the ocean like that. And that Eastern take on Western fantasy is, I think, what at the time made Final Fantasy unique. And if we think about it now, its most memorable parts are probably, you know, we think, you know, about spiky hair, yes, but also about the way that spells are named within the different games in Final Fantasy. You know, the summon spells, those persistent elements in each of the games, even when they change directors and the people who devise the world.
True, stuff like that has become its own like cultural icon itself, right? The games have exploded in that way.
I think that's kind of what, you know, unlike the other games on this list, there's not one idea guy involved in the Final Fantasy games. There's actually three, I think, who we'll mention in a moment. And so that means when we're referring to it as a unified series, we're talking about its aesthetic tropes. Yeah. And what characterizes it specifically is how, you know, the first of its kind, it took all this stuff from Western fantasy and made it uniquely Japanese, right? Yeah. And I think the three names I mentioned before, I'm not here referring to directors. I know we talked about directors and stuff before, but I think the people who are most important in games like this are the people who come up with the world. They're often in Japanese games credited as the person behind the scenario.
Oh, okay.
You know? So in the case of the first Final Fantasy games from 1 through 5, and also 9, and also he contributed to 7, of course, there's Hironobu Sakaguchi.
Yeah, he's actually considered like the sort of like the father of Final Fantasy. That's right? The early days. Yeah, like you said, 1 to 5, and then
I think rightfully so. And in his games, you really get a sense for, I think, what characterizes all games in the JRPG genre, something you'll find in all of them, and that's the delivery of these like cosmic themes, these metaphysical ideas, using human life in fiction, like human relationships and the stuff people do on the day-to-day. You know? Even if people are on like some quest to save the world, there's like moments where you're supposed to relate to and sympathize with them. And that's what makes a JRPG versus something like Dark Souls, which is very impersonal.
Very impersonal, right? That's right, yeah.
You're not supposed to look at your character or even anybody else's real human beings that
Yeah.
you sympathize with the same way you do your family or friends, right?
Yeah.
Final Fantasy, contrarily, and I think this became more true as the series went forward in time, is a game where you're supposed to sympathize with the characters.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, even when they're doing things like examining what it means to be a human subject in Final Fantasy IX, or dealing with these like Kabbalistic religious ideas like Sephiroth and the One and all of that in Final Fantasy VII, there's still like a bunch of characters you're supposed to relate to, and you're supposed to hope that they get together in a romantic situation and, this and that kind of stuff, right? So that's very much in the JRPG mold, and it's something that the games that came after Final Fantasy certainly adopted. I think every game on this list actually shares those qualities.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah. So there's Hironobu Sakaguchi for Final Fantasy 1 through 5. He worked on 7 and 9 as well for the scenario. And then there's Kazuhige Nojima, who designed the worlds of 7, 8, 9, 10, and 15.
Yeah.
Sorry, 7, 8, 10, and 15. 9 is Sakaguchi.
Right.
And lastly, there's Matsuno, who did Tactics, 12, and Vagrant Story, and these are all actually set in the same world of Ivalice. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Especially given that Vagrant Story is a PS1 game, like all the way back then, just goes to show that these people have been there forever.
That's right,
Case
for sure.
with all of them.
Yeah.
And is the reason why these works are so good, right?
That's exactly right. There's a consistent number of people behind the ideas. I think that Sakaguchi directed those games, whereas the Nojima and Matsuno games were directed by Kitase and Ito, respectively. And I think those guys probably had some input on the worlds too, but the chief thing here is that these are the guys who came up with the idea, right? And Final Fantasy has also had a consistent art style via the contributions of Amano in Final Fantasy 1 through 5, and Tetsuya Nomura and the rest of them, with the more anthropomorphic characters we recognize from the modern entries, right? Yeah. And you also have Uematsu's scores. I think he's been a staple in the series.
Nobuyo, he's been around forever, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Next, we have Xenoblade. And unlike Final Fantasy games, I don't think there's many aesthetic similarities to Western fantasy in Xenoblade games, It's not like you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, like a wizard or a, series of jobs derived from D&D, or like spells derived from D&D or something like that, right? It's more alien in terms of the worlds it depicts and how stuff is called and how it looks. But it does lean more heavily into this like Eastern fantasy representation of Western philosophical and religious ideas, which you also see in Final Fantasy, but kind of
Not
more background idea.
Yeah, that's right. Not to this extent, right?
Yeah. And Tetsuya Takahashi, who's responsible for this series, his special focus is the creation of creation myths, of stories about how the world came to be. And it seems to me he's specifically interested in a Gnostic religion or metaphysics, according to which the creation of the physical world was accomplished by like an evil deity who's an evil sub-deity who's not really God, but he pretends to be, and he's kind of preventing you from getting back to this natural and primordial state of things. And that's explored in all of the different Xeno games, from Xenogears on the PS1 to Xenosaga on the PS2, and the Xenoblade Chronicles games on the Nintendo consoles. And it's interesting that this series, unlike the ones we mentioned, the one we mentioned before and the ones we're going to talk about, it's more centered on Takahashi. There's not like a staple artist or a staple composer involved.
So he's like the main guy pretty much.
He's the main guy. So
that's awesome.
We were just saying Final Fantasy, it doesn't really have a consistent set of ideas behind it because it passed between different hands, but it does have a consistent aesthetic, has consistent music and this and that, whereas here I think the opposite is true. The games are all consistent in terms of the ideas they exhibit, but they don't really have a consistent aesthetic, consistent music. They're
like art style and stuff like that. Or...
Yeah. Although it is worth remarking that there's this guy called Genki Yakoda who worked on a bunch of Fire Emblem games after Awakening, and I think he also co-directed a couple of the Xenoblade games too. Yeah, Tetsuya Takahashi games. Check them out. They're like, a little bit more floaty and abstract Final Fantasy, if you ask me. Yeah. There's still a focus on the human element, but everything seems more alien in terms of its aesthetic. It's
very true. The setting is very much out there in terms of, less like...
Western fantasy,
right?
Less like Lord of the Rings, less like D&D, less like medieval Europe, right?
Exactly.
Not supposed to be like that at all. Yeah. There's even some sci-fi elements, like there's characters like that are AIs from computers in the past/future. Like it's
out there. It's really cool.
It's some interesting stuff, and it's different from Final Fantasy in that respect. The third series I think that is amongst the best JRPG series of all time is I was gonna say Persona here, but I want to say Hashino's Shin Megami Tensei games. You know?
Yeah, that's fair, given that, I mean, the Persona games are their own, you know, big in their own right, but they technically were a spin-off of Shin Megami
Yeah,
Tensei,
they were, yeah.
So that deserves to be said, I guess.
For sure. And here, though, I think like the thing about them that's great is specifically the fact that they came from Hashino. That's when the series became what most people recognize it as, I think. And that includes Sojima's art direction, starting with Hashino's first Shin Megami game, I believe, which was Shin Megami Tensei 3. And what characterizes it, I think, is while it does involve this representation of like supernatural and metaphysical themes using, you know, human relationships, human conduct in fiction, we're not dealing here with Western fantasy aesthetic like ogres and wizards and stuff like that, nor are we dealing with something alien at all. Here we're dealing with like magical realism, like dictionary magical realism,
injected straight out of basically the real world, just, you know, shot with like you said, magic and fantasy.
That's right.
Really cool. I
Here,
like to see stuff like that.
Yeah, it's cool. You don't see it very often at all. It's very unique. Here the cosmic concerns are like lurking behind everyday life. Like you're a high school student and you spend your evenings like infiltrating people's hearts so as to via the medium of like this, you know, shared unconscious, so that you can convince them not to be evil in the real world. Right? And there's simultaneously this like pandemic of like people losing their minds and crashing their cars going on, which probably has something to do with it. So yeah, it's a very different kind of fantasy, but it's still a JRPG in the relevant sense, which is that, you know, it involves turn-based combat and the depiction of these cosmic themes using human relationships and stuff like that, right? And then lastly, we should mention Dragon Quest.
Yeah, Dragon Quest is it's important, I think, too, because it's one of those series that has been around since pretty much the Final Fantasy days. Like it goes back, its roots go back, you know, back then to the, you know, late 80s. Yeah. Along with Final Fantasy 1, 2, and whatever. It does.
I think you can also see their like mutual origin in that period of time and how it also just blatantly appropriates like Western fantasy themes and ideas and
That's
tropes,
true.
Right? Like there's also like, you know, you can look at its art and see like medieval Europe. You can see wizards with pointy hats and green goblins and all this kind of stuff, right? So as with the JRPG genre as a whole here, we do have fantasy tropes and religious concepts appropriated from the West. You know, there's wizards and all that stuff I just said, magic systems. There's like this cosmic evil who's the bad guy. There's like a child of light or this Christ figure who's born to defeat him. But Dragon Quest is unique amongst these series on this list because of its upfront levity and optimism, I think. It's got a lightheartedness and goofiness with which it conveys this subject matter that none of these other games have.
That's true. Yeah, like the other games will have sprinkles of it, let's say, especially in a Final Fantasy. Like you'll get those comedic relief characters.
They're not true. They're not, you know, morbid games by any stretch of the imagination, but they do take themselves seriously by and large, right?
Yeah, and Dragon Quest kind of feels like
it doesn't really know.
Yeah, it kind of feels like it doesn't take itself seriously.
It's more cute and goofy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. More upfront, like funny, and
there's something to that aspect of Japanese media too that it leans into, and it does have immediately recognizable art from Toriyama. Toriyama from Dragon Ball,
Dragon Ball Z. If you've seen any, it looks amazing.
Unfortunately, he won't be contributing anymore because he's passed. But it is cool that like the other two, at least two of the other games on this list, there's a recognizable art style associated with this series, you know?
That's right.
And there's been the same guy behind it always. His name is Yuji Horii. You know, I think he owns Dragon Quest himself, and he has an exclusive publishing contract with Square Enix, which is interesting.
That's crazy.
Amongst these series, awesome. It's unique on this list, right? And there's also been a composer who's been on board since the beginning. I think his name is Sugiyama. Yeah, and his music, of course, consolidates this cheerfulness and optimism of the series. Like when you hear it, it makes you feel like
very upbeat, very uplifting, right?
Yeah.
It's
that's right.
Dragon Quest is one of those games that's just such a joy to boot up and just to, you know, see the title screen, hear the music, and just play it. That's great.
Right. That's right. Yeah, and it's lastly worth noting that these games all have very similar combat. I wouldn't say many of them are mechanically different, you know, especially Final Fantasy, most of them before the live action ones or the real-time ones, however you want to call it. Not Final Fantasy, not Persona, not Dragon Quest. Their gameplay largely coheres, but Xenoblade is the only game on our list here that innovates in some large, some recognizable capacity on that formula, right?
Not your bog standard turn-based where you just select actions.
You're not just selecting menu commands, and not that I'm complaining about that at all. You know, I think there's something excellent in like perfecting a mode of artistic
experimentation
right?
is good, right? There's nothing wrong with trying different systems out and whatever works for
there's
your
definitely
game.
not. But there's nothing wrong with becoming a master in a pre-existing form either, right? Like
That's
both
right.
can be good. So I think you do see that with many of the games on this list. But what Xenoblade does is it incorporates real-time combat and positioning based status effects and damage bonuses and stuff like that. So instead of standing in place and selecting things from a menu, you still have like a menu of like abilities that you activate in real time, but you have to like put yourself in certain places around the enemy to get bonuses from those attacks.
Yeah, and they have cooldowns, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's almost like semi-real time, right? It's almost like, it reminds me of an MMO.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It is like an MMO style combat.
So it's a lot more involved, I guess, as you're actually playing it. It's really possible to mess up and just based on where you're standing, it's not an easy game. It's definitely the hardest one on this list.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. It feels hands off like at the beginning, but as you sort of unlock more stuff and as you go through the game, it expands. Yeah, exactly.
You have to be busy all the time. So it's definitely the hardest and the most mechanically innovative on this list, whereas I think the others all kind of adhere to the same design conventions at a mechanical level.
Yeah, for the most part, pretty much.
Yeah, so those are the 4 best JRPG series of all time, I think.
Yeah, I would be hard-pressed to disagree with any of the choices here.
In any case, I think that's enough for today. Thank you guys very much for tuning in, and please do play your JRPGs.
Oh, yeah.